I went to a marvelous party with Nunu and Nada and Nell. It was fresh in the air, and we went as we were, and we stayed as we were, which was hell. Perhaps you will be surprised to know that was not Virgil's Aeneid that I just read from. That was I Went to a Marvelous Party by Noel Coward. If you're not familiar with the works of Noel Coward, do yourself a favor, check it out. He's absolutely hilarious, and he has that great line that I couldn't stop thinking about as I was getting ready to do this next episode on the Aeneid, because we are in hell, arguably. This next portion of the poem is the next stage in the katabasis, the descent into the underworld. And one of the things I was thinking about, and that maybe we can think about together, is whether the word hell is appropriate for all or some of these regions that Aeneas is about to pass through. Hell is a Christian concept, the idea of a place of eternal torment or punishment in the afterlife to correspond to the blessing that you get if you love God and God saves you, etc., etc. This is distinctively Christian, but not necessarily uniquely Christian. The idea of justice after death is one that we have throughout all of history, but there's a million different ways of telling that story, and there are some versions of it that don't quite involve the same kind of judgment or even maybe necessarily any justice at all. And what you think about the afterlife defines what you think about the present life, which is still true. What the way you think the world is structured, the justice or lack of justice in the universe is going to affect how you live your life here and now. So these maps that we build of the world beyond this one, the world of eternal life for souls or life after death for souls, is really a way of visually and physically representing what we think is the structure, the ultimate structure of the cosmos and the universe. And if you think there's nothing out there, if you think the only structure there is are these physical structures that we live in and then our bodies die and they decompose, that is also a map of the afterlife. It's a negative map, or a map that says there's nothing, just dark, dark, dark after our death, and that will affect how you live your life. But if you think that there is an intricately ordered hierarchy of heavenly spheres stretching all the way down to the earth, and then beneath the earth, 9 circles of hell, or what have you, that too will affect the way you live your life. And this picture that we have of life after death is one of the things that all humans, whether they know it or not, are concerned with, are thinking about. And Virgil's is one of the most famous ones. And the thing that we're going to talk about today, as Aeneas starts to journey down into the underworld, we're going to talk about the fact that Virgil's underworld has a very distinctive map. It has a topography, a geography. Over here, there's this kind of person who lived this kind of life. Over there, there's that kind of person who lived that kind of life. And Aeneas is going to wander or travel with the guidance of the Sibyl, the prophetess. He's going to travel through all sorts of different regions, places where people died for love or where they died in the longing of unrequited love, places. He won't quite go to Tartarus, which is the darkest depth of punishment for the worst people, but he will hear about it and brush near it. So that also has a location relative to where he is. And we're going to take him in this episode right up to the border of Elysium, which is basically the closest thing to our Christian idea of heaven. We'll talk about the ways that it is similar and isn't similar. But to get into this, I want to kind of give you an overview of some of the different ways throughout history in the major ancient civilizations that we know about, some of the different ways people had of mapping the afterlife, mapping the cosmic universe post-death. And that's because it's kind of fascinating, I think, and awesome to learn about all this stuff, but also because when we talk about this, there's a very silly modern conceit that these are all just primitive mythologies. And now we know better. Sometimes even people who are religious talk this way. Christians, for example, will say, well, of course, now we know that heaven isn't up there in the clouds because we've got spaceships and we can travel, and we know that the earth is a globe and not a flat disk and all of these things. And there are pieces of physical information that we have and have gained through modern science. But sometimes that leads us into the mistake of thinking that pre-scientific people didn't understand metaphor or symbolism or allegory, and just thought that when they talked about the afterworld, they were talking about like what would happen if you took a rocket ship up into space. Instead, it's much closer to this universe is structured in a symbolic way. Ancient peoples thought of the universe as structured in a symbolic way. And so even if they felt, some of them presumably did feel, that the earth really was a round disk and beyond it there was a great ocean, and when we die we pass into the ocean or what have you, nevertheless they would have thought that the more important fact is not whether that ocean is actually made of the same kind of water as our Pacific Ocean, but rather what that ocean stands in for and what it represents. And therefore, when we read these stories, what we're really getting is we're getting a communication of how they understood the organization of ultimate things. And I suspect if you went back in time and you told Aristotle, or you told the scribes who wrote down what we now call the Book of the Dead in Egypt, you said, actually, the material that's up there is slightly different and it's oriented in slightly different ways. They wouldn't say, oh, that means everything we believe about the afterlife is wrong. They would just say, oh, the material substrate, the physical embodiment of these truths looks slightly different than we thought it looked. And because that's true, because what we're getting across here is a kind of spiritual vision of how things are, we can still get an enormous amount out of these ancient pictures of the afterlife because they're not primarily physical pictures. They might have physical components, physical dimensions, but the physics of them are really just kind of stand-ins or means of conveyance for the ultimate spiritual realities. And again, this is still true. The way that you view the physical universe, even the way you organize the physical universe in your philosophy, is expressive of something higher than that, your spiritual attitude. I don't have time to get into that part, the modern physics part, on this episode, but if you are interested in it, you absolutely, I can heartily recommend, should check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. It's available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And I keep hearing from people who are discovering this book anew. So if you haven't already, and if you would like to, please do go check that out. For now, though, we're not going to talk about modern science. We're going to talk about ancient things, the ancientest of all the things that we can know about, which is not the same thing as saying the ancientest myth that was ever told or the ancientest human civilization that ever was, because there are many, many things that happened before the invention, the development of writing, which starts to make itself known to us around the 4th millennium BC. And that's when we start to get hieroglyphs and cuneiform, which are the Egyptian and Assyrian, Babylonian styles of writing, Sumerian style of writing, respectively. And then shortly after that, in the 2nd millennium BC, we start to get alphabetic writing, the kind of writing that will eventually develop into the English alphabet and the Latin alphabet and the Greek alphabet and so forth. And so that's where we really can start to know in detail about people's beliefs about the afterlife. Again, it doesn't mean that cave people in like the Blombus Nature Preserve in South Africa didn't have beliefs about the afterlife, just that all they left behind is a few like scratches on stone and ochre, and that doesn't really give us detailed information. This is why writing is a useful technology, among other reasons. So the first and oldest vision of the afterlife, I think, that we should keep in our minds as we go into Virgil's afterlife is the Egyptian vision. And I'm saying that because it's one of our oldest pictures of the afterlife, but also because for Virgil, the Egyptians would have been the embodiment of all things old. We get this from Greek philosophy onward, that Whereas we think of the Greeks and Romans as from way back in the before times, the Greeks and Romans thought of the Egyptians as being way back in the before times. And they were right about that. I mean, we are closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the builders of the pyramids. So this is a civilization that goes way, way back. And yet, even as far back as it goes, when we start to get texts and writing and hieroglyphic inscriptions from the Egyptian civilization, it's clear that they're already pretty developed and sophisticated. We already have a very elaborate kind of picture of the cosmos. So I'm not saying that the Egyptians represent like the primitive or original way that people would tend to look at these things, just that they represent one of the core ways, and they would have been regarded that way in antiquity as well, which is why it's cool that we have all of these Egyptian texts that we call collectively by the name the Book of the Dead. And if you've heard that before, it's one of the most famous elements of ancient Egyptian civilization. If you studied the ancient Egyptians in school, you probably saw illustrations from the Book of the Dead. The name the Book of the Dead is a little bit misleading. It describes a bunch of different papyrus scrolls and even other things, tomb inscriptions and writings that in turn were derived from yet older writings from around 2400 BC. We have these things that we call the pyramid texts that first are for kings. When the king dies, you want him to be able to navigate the afterlife correctly. That's the idea. And the Egyptians were incredibly concerned with the idea that life begins at death, essentially, especially for the highest members of society, but eventually for more and more people. And so you have a bunch of different versions of what comes to be called in its ancient form. The ancient title is The Book of Going Forth by Day, which is a title I think is so much cooler even than the Book of the Dead. Book of the Dead is obviously a great title, but the Book of Going Forth by Day is very mysterious and evocative, and I think it conveys this sense that daylight dawns when you die, that this is the most important part of your life, and everything else has essentially been preparation for that, which tells us that that's a very, very old idea. It's not just the Christians who came up with the idea that this life is a kind of training ground or a veil that we pass through. This seems to be one of the first ideas that we can bear witness to, is that your daylight dawns when you die, and then you go forth, and you need, the Egyptians think, a bunch of tools and equipment to guide you through, because the afterlife is not just a sparse wasteland in the Egyptian point of view. It's an incredibly detailed, ornate, and elaborate society, the society of gods. So another very old idea is that when humans die, the ideal is for them to join the gods, to enter among the state of the blessed, and to pass somehow into the powers of nature that have always seemed suggestive of divine power. All paganism, that is, all non-revealed, non-Abrahamic faiths, seem to have this structure that the world is full of powers beyond our understanding, our control. Those are ultimately sprung from a divine source, and we are going there. If we're going to go anywhere, that's where we're going. Now, we're going to get later on to visions of the afterlife that don't really posit this, that say actually humanity isn't destined for the gods. But the Egyptians think at least the best among us can make their way to be with the gods. And so you get these very, very famous images in the Book of the Dead. Some of the copies of this are beautifully illustrated and really ornately written down. One of the most famous stories that we get here is when you weigh your heart. So dead people, first of all, they have to kind of reanimate the body because the soul needs the body to kind of progress. And that's why the mummification process was so intense and why all the organs were preserved in the canopic jars and so on and so forth. But one of the things you have to do is you have to weigh your heart against a feather. And the idea is, of course, that the light heart is one that's unburdened by guilt, and so that heart will rise in the scale. But if the feather rises and the heart falls down, then you don't pass the test. But there's a bunch of these. That's the most famous one because it's the most on the nose, obvious, evocative symbol. But there are all sorts of different procedures. There are magic spells that you have to know, and so those will be written down, different versions of them depending on what the scribe involved thinks you might need and what the priests have prescribed at this particular period. This is basically like a Lonely Planet travel guidebook to the afterlife, right? And just like there are many different editions and many different brands even besides Lonely Planet of travel guides, there's one city called Paris, but there's the Lonely Planet travel guide, there's the Baedeker, if you know about those, there's a bunch of different, there's a Michelin guide, right? There are many, many different guides to the afterlife, many, many different versions of the Book of the Dead, but only one afterlife. And it has this basic structure of judgment and transmutation into or among the gods. You do all sorts of things, like you rise each day with the sun god Ra for a while, which is like, I don't know, kind of an apprenticeship among the gods or something. And ultimately, the ideal is that you won't come back to this plane, but you will transmute, you will pass and transcend into the divine heavenly future that you are destined for. So that's one kind of picture, one option of what might be out there. But there are others, and there are others from around the same level of antiquity. I'm thinking especially here of Assyria and Babylon and the Mesopotamian civilizations, which begin with Sumer. That's a whole different complex of myths that has some similarities with the Egyptian way of looking at things, but in other ways is quite different. So now we're going to move over, if you think about Egypt, we're moving to the northeast to go to Mesopotamia, in Greek, the land between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And over there, you have this other pantheon, and the gods there have slightly less familiar names. If you know the god Ra, the sun god Ra from Egypt, and maybe you know Osiris, and you know some of these other Egyptian gods, you might not have heard of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war and sex, basically the goddess of adrenaline, or Marduk, whom we've talked about a little bit before on this show, the Zeus of the Babylonian pantheon. And there are some differences from the Sumerian to the Assyrian to the Babylonian texts, but just like the Romans and the Greeks basically have the same gods, the Mesopotamian civilizations basically have the same gods with some variety of names. And they have one myth that they tell in multiple different versions about how Ishtar, the goddess of, again, sex and war and basically vitality, life, how she descends into the underworld. And what I find really interesting about this in comparison to the Egyptian version is that it's, first of all, it's a goddess who's going down, who's doing this katabasis. It's not a human hero. And it's not clear even that human heroes are equipped to do this, to go down to the underworld. Many of the Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts that we have deal, in fact, with the inevitable mortality of humans, which is underscored again and again, for instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? So it's not clear in this worldview that humanity is even destined for eternal life. It seems more possible that what happens is we kind of evaporate and dissolve. And one reason I think that is because of this myth, which we get in a few different copies, cuneiform, again, written down copies of a myth that is sometimes called the descent of Inanna or Ishtar's descent into the underworld. It's also known by its incipit, which is a wonderful technical scholarly term from the Latin word for beginning. And that just means sometimes ancient texts are called by the first word or words in the text. So the Enuma Elish, for instance, the Babylonian creation story is called that because Enuma Elish are the first words, when on high, and then it goes on, heaven and earth had no names. And similarly, the incipit of the Inanna Ishtar myth is Angalta, from the great sky. So just like the Book of Going Forth by Day tells you something about the Egyptian view of the afterlife, this myth tells you from the great sky that Inanna has to descend from the realm of the gods in order to go down into the underworld. And she goes. The reason she goes is to conquer her sister, Ereshkigal, who is the queen of the underworld. She's kind of like a Persephone figure, although seemingly more of a queen than a princess. And we don't exactly know why Inanna has taken this into her head, but one reason might be that this vision of the cosmos is a fundamentally dualist or conflict-ridden vision of the cosmos. Whereas, if you think about the Egyptians, it's like there is a realm of the gods. And yes, they have conflicts and they have squabbles, but there's such a thing as like an eternal afterlife passing into the good and the good winning. Here, we have almost like a perpetual battle between the good and the evil, or the life and the death. And that's baked into a lot of Mesopotamian mythology. That the creation story begins with two forces, Apsu and Tiamat, the water gods kind of coiling, and that's how the universe is structured. And so here we have this force of love and life, Inanna, going down into the underworld. And when she goes, she's stripped of her powers. She basically dissolves progressively into the great nothing. And people on Earth stop having sex and stop making babies, and the cows don't have babies anymore. None of the livestock has sex. Like the life force just drains out of the world. And so this is a vision not of an afterlife with a geography so much as an afterlife with the opposite of geography, emptiness, pure zero. And this is the other picture, a distinct picture that we also have an option for organizing the afterlife, where there's this little core, this huddling light, this shimmering place where we live, where there's order and harmony and form and human perception. And beyond that, dark, 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 dark. And that's something that comes up again and again as kind of the bleak or the pessimistic picture. So if the Egyptian picture is like kind of optimistic because there's this structure to the afterlife and there's the possibility of reward, the Mesopotamian picture is kind of pessimistic. And I think this is one of the things that the Bible is grappling with, because this is the picture that the Jews would have had to fight against to make the claims of their religion, is the Mesopotamian picture where Earth begins in chaos, order arises out of chaos, but order kind of collapses back into chaos after death. And I would propose that these are fundamentally the two options: the picture of order as the ultimate truth that it begins before life and endures after death, or the picture of chaos and emptiness as the ultimate truth that begins before life and persists after death. In other words, we're either in this little transient moment of uncertainty before we pass into the great cosmic light and order, and this place, this earth, is the least organized, the least rational, the least blessed place in the world. Or we are in this little transient blip of light and order before we pass out into the great vast emptiness and chaos. And I think that all worldviews can basically be divided into these two portions. And there's reason for thinking either one, right? We can either say, well, our order, the order that we perceive in the universe, our rational minds, they can't come from nowhere, right? They suggest that reason is something which exists out there in the great beyond. Or we can say, well, we see that all things die and fall apart, and the law of the universe is basically chaos, right? Chaos theory tells us that you can't unstir the porridge once you've stirred it, and entropy will ultimately bring the universe down to a vast confusion and emptiness. And this option is the one that has become predominant in the wake of certain scientific developments, right? These days, a lot of people think that science, quote unquote, proves one version of the universe over the other, namely the dark, empty version of the universe, where our meaning and our life and our order is just a temporary accident in the midst of what is fundamentally an empty and uncaring universe. Now, again, read my book to find out why that's not true, why science doesn't actually show that. But just to say for now that these are kind of two broad brush options. And of course, within each civilization, you have people that have different varieties of points of view, and you have some Babylonian cosmogonies and visions of the universe that are slightly less disordered than what I've just pictured, and some Egyptian ideas that suggest a little bit more doubt and uncertainty. But I think, broadly speaking, the categories that I have laid out for you here hold good, and they are the two options. Either you have order and then the chaos of earth, and then order of heaven again, or you have the chaos of the beyond, and then the brief flickering order of earth and chaos and dark forever again. And these are all kind of cool to know about because they're cool to know about, but also they're relevant as we turn now to the Greeks, right? Because remember that the Greeks and the Romans are the culture that we're talking about, but we have to always understand that they operate within a pre-existing range of options and cultures, and they come relatively late. In fact, in Plato, the Egyptians laugh at the Greeks because they're so young, because they've only been around for a little bit of time. And so Greek and Roman mythology and philosophy are already engaging with a bunch of pre-existing mythologies and philosophies, sort of like the Bible is also engaging with a bunch of others and saying, no, it's not that way, it's this way. This is also true in Greece of the Greek idea of the cosmos and the heavens, and that's the vision that Virgil is then going to inherit. So Virgil, by the time we get to the Aeneid, we're very, very late on in these developments. Greece is an interesting case then, because we have these two major options and we have elements of each option, the order option and the chaos option, in Greek mythology. There's a geography to the afterlife basically from the beginning, from as soon as we get the poems of Homer and Hesiod, so now we're up to around the 8th century BC. From that moment on, there are different regions in the world beyond. There is Tartarus, which I mentioned earlier, and that's the closest thing to our hell. And so it's sort of like a place of punishment where the worst people go. There's Elysium, where it seems like maybe heroes go. And we get these things in our earliest sources, places like Hesiod's Theogony, and these early epic poems tell us that there are these regions. What they don't do is get specific about where these regions are, and they don't give us the kind of cartography of the afterworld that we would need to really say, okay, this is a universe where there is absolutely order and justice and structure to life after death, beyond just what we can see here. And in fact, also from very early on, we have these stories like the story of Odysseus, which I told you when we did our Odyssey series, where he travels out to the great ocean. And the ocean is basically a giant river that encircles the world. And it's in that region that he calls up the souls of the dead. He doesn't even technically go down into the underworld. And the suggestion is that you probably couldn't, right? Just like Inanna, only the goddess Inanna has to go down to the underworld. And even then she basically gets dissolved and stripped of her power. In Homer, the place of the underworld, the place of the dead, is a place of shadows and almost non-being. And so the hero, Odysseus, can't do a katabasis. He can't go down. He has to call the spirits up. And you may remember in Book 11 of the Odyssey that he calls the spirits up using blood because they need substance. They don't have that substance in the way that, say, an Egyptian pharaoh could expect to have his mummified body and his substance ready to go in the afterlife and all this form and order. In Homer, it's not clear that that's true. In fact, it seems almost like there's something more Babylonian about this vision of Okeanos, the ocean encircling the world. Water, always the symbol of chaos, right? This is true in the Bible. It's true in the myths. Because water is formless or liquid as compared to earth, wherever it is, you know that this is an image of basically like quantum uncertainty, like what we think of now when we talk about the fields at the Big Bang or whatever there was before this universe. That's what myths mean when they talk about water. And this is true in Babylon, the Babylonian picture of the earth. We have these maps, these wonderful maps that come down to us from the libraries of the Assyrian and Babylonian kings. And the Babylonian map of the universe, if you think of our world as a kind of sphere, not the globe that we now think of, but like a flat disk of land with a big dome up above in heaven, and then perhaps another dome underneath down below. Everything around that is encircled by this freshwater ocean called Apsu. And that's the Apsu and Tiamat that I mentioned earlier, the gods, right, who fight at the beginning of the world or mingle at the beginning of the world. You have this big encircling ocean called Apsu, and you have this kind of girdle, this coiling saltwater ocean called Tiamat, the feminine chaos goddess who circles around like a belt or a girdle around the sphere of existence. That's not unlike the map that we get in Homer, that there is this little island of meaning, form, order, storytelling. And then there is Okeanos. There's the ocean. There's the Cimmerians, the people of the dark, the people of the falling, setting sun. Right. And so this land where things dissolve and where there's not the same kind of form and order seems to be the picture that we get, combined with the idea that actually, though, somehow beyond that, in this unimaginable formless depth, there is also judgment, and there are maybe different regions, and there are gods. And so there's like an ambiguity or a confusion there that is beautiful and cosmically, mythologically potent, but unsatisfying for a philosopher or a theologian, right? For somebody who wants to know, well, what do we think about the ultimate things? It's inevitable, probably, that a civilization like Greek civilization is going to set about eventually asking, well, what do we mean by all of this? We have these different options. Different cultures have different ways of looking at things. What's the Greek way, or what's the true way, even? And it's in that context that I think we should understand another ancient Greek text, and that is Plato's Republic, Book 10. And it's called The Myth of We did this long, long ago when we talked about the Republic, but it bears kind of revisiting and reconsidering, because I think this is where you start to get the synthesis of these ideas that is going to become really the background of Virgil's story of Aeneas' journey through the afterlife. So the myth of is a myth designed to ultimately answer the question of justice that the Republic is all about. And the idea of the Republic is it's a kind of artificial controlled experiment where Socrates and his fellow discussion partners, philosophers, I guess you could call them, they talk together about justice and whether it's worth it to be just, whether it's good in itself to be just. And in order to do that, they say, let's imagine that you don't get anything else for being just besides being just. You don't get anything as a reward for being a good person. You just get the inherent reward of being a good person. And in fact, we'll make it harder. Let's imagine that the truly just man would actually be treated cruelly and punished as if he were an unjust man. Let's imagine, even say that he were crucified, right? Would it still be worth it to be just, to be a good person? And they spend all this time trying to answer that question, which leads them into this discussion of the perfect state and so on and so forth. But then at the very end, they say, okay, now let's take the training wheels off and let's make the case for justice as it really exists in the world, which, Socrates argues, actually doesn't get you just punishment. It also comes with all sorts of lovely rewards. And that's true in a righteous civilization where on Earth you might get rewards for being just. But since justice in this world is incomplete, and since sometimes good people do get punished, Socrates has to say, no, actually, justice gets rewards infinitely, eternally, beyond this life and beyond just the scope of one human life. And so he tells this story that is basically like one of those stories you get in books about like people that come back from comas or near-death experiences. If you've ever read or looked at one of those books where people say, oh, I technically medically died for 10 minutes and then I came back and I saw this, tunnel of light, and I saw my friends and my lost loved ones, etc. That's the myth of That's the story that Socrates tells at the end of the Republic. And is the name of a guy, Ada Rho, if you know the Greek alphabet, who has a near-death experience or a brief medical death on the battlefield. And is a fella from Pamphylia, which is important because Pamphylia is this region in the south of Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And the name means mingled race or all race. It's where all the different families of the earth are kind of combined, or it's a mixed race, essentially, is Pamphylia. So this is kind of like the everyman tribe. And in fact, this region to the south and especially to the east of Turkey, or Anatolia, as it was sometimes called, is the hub. It's the biblical land of Ararat, where Noah lands after the flood. That's, again, this is slightly more to the east than where Pamphylia was. But this general region, right, is Ararat. And it is, our evolutionary biologists now think, it is where humanity made its way up out of Africa. The human race, when it first evolved, made its way up out of Africa, made contact with the Neanderthals somewhere around this area. So everyone outside of Africa now has like 1.5 to 2.5% Neanderthal DNA. And in that hub, in that region, the peoples of the world then spread out. So the biblical story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons spreading out, the DNA story that we have of Homo sapiens mating with Neanderthals, and even this idea of Pamphylia in the south of what's now Turkey, all has this idea that in that region somewhere there is a kind of nexus or hub of humanity where all the different races, the cradle of nations, right, where all the different races first come from and where they might come together. So that's the myth of Ur, right? Is like, this is the story that everyone goes through. It's a universal story about the human condition. And Socrates wonderfully says, it's not going to be the same story that Odysseus told to Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians. That's the story that we get in Odyssey, book 11, as Odysseus is narrating his story. But by the time Plato's writing, that had become proverbial for like a long, tall tale, basically just going on, a shaggy dog story. And Plato famously doesn't have a lot of respect for the veracity, or at least claims not to have a lot of respect for the veracity of these poetic tales. So he says, I'm going to tell you the real myth, the real truth of what happens after you die. And I got it from field reporting, from this near-death experience of this guy, from Pamphylia, universal everyman. And he says that when you die, you go to this very complicated conveyor belt of judgment, of different kinds of rewards and punishments for the ways that you have behaved in death. And those are mapped onto a particular region of the universe. So this is Plato very definitively plunking for the order version of the heavens, of the universe. There's order beyond this earth. And in fact, this earth is only the beginning or the lowest point on a huge hierarchy of righteousness and justice. And the way it works is basically you get to the door, there are judges, which will become important for Virgil and also for Dante later on. But you get these judgments passed upon you based on how you've behaved. And the first thing you do is you go through 10 times the punishment or 10 times the reward of whatever you did on earth. And if you were bad overall, you pass down under the earth and you get suffering and torment and pain. If you were really, really bad, you never come back from that. That's like eternal punishment, eternal Tartarus, essentially. But if you were really, really good, you go up kind of into the heavens and you get bliss and wonderment and loveliness. And then you circle around back down on this conveyor belt to the final part of the journey. And this is reincarnation. So interestingly, what Plato's basically doing here is he's saying there is a kind of infinity of human life, but he leaves open the question, like, what is the best? What's the best thing that we should hope for? Because he wants it to be justice in itself, right? And so you can get ultimate punishment in Tartarus, but if you're really, really good, actually the best thing that happens might be not that you stay forever in the blessed fields, but that you get reconstituted as a truly just man. And what's really smart about the myth or the story that Socrates tells is that after you've gone through all your punishments and rewards and you've been cleansed of your sins or you've been rewarded for your good things, then you get one last choice, and you get a kind of a lottery token that determines the pecking order, who gets to choose their next life first. And then everyone gets offered this kind of big bucket of different possible lives that you might lead next. And so you get to make your choice based on the journey that you've just gone through and the experience that you've had during life. And of course, the moral here now comes as the kicker, that after you've been through all of this rigmarole, the thing that is going to determine the goodness of your next life is your personal choice. And so really it's all a test to shape you and to make you better at choosing, or to challenge you to become better at choosing. And that's why justice is the most important thing, because you're going to be looking at all these different possibilities. You could be a cat, or you could be a king, you could be a tyrant, you could be whatever. And you have to learn to sift out the irrelevant things of life, wealth, for instance, and success and fame and power, and just go for justice itself. You have to learn to recognize justice. And the key, says Socrates, is to know how beauty, commingled with poverty or wealth and combined with what habit of soul, operates for good or for evil. In other words, what is truly good? All of life is basically a training regimen, if you do it right, in learning how to do that. And what are the effects of high and low birth and private station and office and strength and weakness and quickness of apprehension and dullness and all similar natural and acquired habits of the soul when blended and combined with one another, so that with consideration of all these things, one will be able to make a reasoned choice between the better and the worse life. Now, this image of life is incredibly effective, potent, and influential for all the rest of the history of philosophy, including the Christian history. This picture of the divine kind of choice at the end of your life, which also comes along with all sorts of imagery like the music of the spheres. It's coordinated according to the different planets that we see in the sky. As Plato says, this is all part of the big structure, the spindle of the fates, right? This is right up in Dante, right? Dante takes a lot of this for his paradiso, for his vision of heaven, and in general for his idea that in hell and in heaven, the consequences of our choices get literalized. They get forced upon us in their absolute form. But there's a major difference, which is that for Plato, the furthest, utmost thing that we can hope for is a just life again and again, essentially, like a kind of reincarnation. For Dante and for the Christian vision, we finally end up in an ultimate state. But all of the rest of this is there, that we've made our choices, and our choices are by definition heaven or hell, right? It's not that we get some exterior punishment. Somebody says like, oh, I'm going to wrap you on the wrist because you were mean to Sally. It's like, no, being mean to Sally is going to corrode your soul until ultimately you're trapped in a prison of rage if you just keep doing it this way, right? That is the idea that gets picked up from Plato into Dante, and this map of the afterlife is basically the one that is going to take hold and set in. It's a map of ultimate divine order, cosmic order, and yet it also has all these elements drawn from elsewhere. And so that's why I said at the beginning, it's not clear whether we really are in hell here or not with Virgil. We're in something that is starting to take the shape of what will become the Christian heaven and the Christian hell. And that's why Dante has Virgil, again, lead him all the way up to the gates of paradise, but not into paradise itself. Because the idea is Virgil receives from Plato and from even the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, receives the sum mass of human thought about this as it has been organized and refined and structured over the centuries until he can give you everything up to Christian salvation, everything up to the final infinite blessedness that is salvation through Christ. But everything before that has basically been mapped out by the thinkers that went before Virgil, and Virgil kind of encapsulates it or puts it into this one picture. And so for the ancients, for the pagans, what happens after you choose your life is you drink from the river of Lethe, that is the river of forgetfulness, and your life starts again. You forget your old life and you start again, and you have another shot at it. And this is basically, we're now ready to go enter into Virgil's map. So remember that when we left Aeneas, he had just gotten the golden bough, which enabled his entry into the afterlife. You need to pluck, like the sword from the stone, you have to pluck the golden bough from the tree, and then the Sibyl will lead you down into the underworld. And the underworld for Virgil very much has a map, unlike for Odysseus, where it's really just this shadowy region beyond, we're not sure, and the dead people come up from there. The Virgilian underworld is like very distinctly mapped out and defined, and it's mapped out in a way that is going to be profoundly influential for Dante. Dante is going to pick up a lot of this right out of Book 6 when he sets out to compose his Inferno, including, for example, the fact that at the door of the underworld, or at the entrance to the underworld, there are all these evil, ugly monsters, kind of like strange, deformed creatures that are fused with body parts and all sorts of grossness. They have names like grief, anxiety, there's diseases, there's old age, fear, hunger, death, right? These are the kind of forces of oblivion and pain. And sleep is one of them too. Sleep is down there, hypnos. And they make their way sort of past all of these. They have a kind of like divine protection because of the golden bough. It's clear that the gods mean for this to happen. They finally make it up to the shore of Acheron. And here things get a little murky because Acheron and Styx are the two rivers that are variously in the myths, in the Greek sources and the Roman sources. It's like either Acheron or Styx is the boundary line between the living and the dead. It's not clear which one exactly. Virgil basically maps it out so that the two rivers, Acheron and Styx, are on either side of a marsh. And the marsh is what you have to cross when the ferryman, Charon, whom you may have seen or heard of, he's in the movie Hercules, by the Disney movie version, and he's in a bunch of other depictions. He comes to take the souls across. And he's very strict. He won't take anyone who hasn't had a burial. And so this is where, at the brink of Acheron, this is where Aeneas meets up with Palinurus, his helmsman, who has died and who remains unburied. And we covered this when we talked about Book 5 as the crew was making its way on toward Cumae. Palinurus dies, and now he has an episode very much like Elpenor in the Odyssey. If you remember, Elpenor was Odysseus' buddy who got unburied, and he came to encounter Odysseus in the afterlife and to remonstrate with him about this. Palinurus comes, and Aeneas assures him, yes, you will get a burial, you will get a cape named after you, Cape Palinuro. So this is an etiological description of why the place is called that. And unbeknownst to even Virgil, you will get a lobster named after you. Consider the lobster. This is there's a kind of lobster now called Palinurus, named after this guy. I'm pretty sure. So he got even more memorial than he bargained for, and that means that he can go across the marsh to go into the ultimate resting place of the dead, or to the place where the dead are supposed to go, I guess is a better way of putting that. So can Aeneas, even though Charon kind of grumbles about it, since people are always breaking his rules. They're always coming out. Hercules came over, all these underground catabases that have happened. Charon is very grumpy about it, but he gets shown the golden bough, and he falls silent, and he sees that, yes, this is in fact, it's time for Aeneas to go. They travel over the marsh, over the river Styx, and they end up at the cave of Cerberus. Now, Cerberus is one of the all-time, stars of Greek mythology. He's made famous in Disney's Hercules as well. But again, it's like these are iconic, some of these images. And in part, they're iconic because of Virgil. It's Virgil who makes these memorable and who gives them their most famous poetic form. But Cerberus is the three-headed dog, right, who guards the underworld. And unlike Charon, he can't really be reasoned with. He's very much a savage beast. And I want to read what happens here, because I've done a little translation of just this passage where Cerberus is drugged, lulled to sleep with a treat, a doggy treat, by Sybil. It's just, there's something really, to me, touching and human and funny about this, even as it's very dramatic. So, as always, translating here into Alexandrines, this is where Cerberus shows up. Virgil writes, these regions echo with the triple-throated snarls of Cerberus, lounging in his cave, a hulking mass. Upon the sight of him, his necks entwined with coils of seething vipers, instantly the prophetess pulled out a scrap of honey cake, all soaked with drugs and laced with drowsy fruits, and tossed it to the dog. Here, Fido, chew on that. He snapped it up, 3 gaping throats all ravenous to catch her toss, then stretched his massive back and slumped upon the ground along the whole enormous cave. I love that detail because if you have a dog, you've seen it do exactly what Virgil's describing here, where they kind of rear their haunches up and their shoulders get scrunched up and they stretch out and then they slump down, they flump onto the floor. So Cerberus starts to act basically like a big oversized puppy when he gets this treat. And then he slumps upon the ground along the whole enormous cave. Aeneas reached the entrance with the guard knocked out and quickly left the riverbank of no return. There's all these wonderful phrases for the different regions here. The riverbank of no return is how I've translated the ripa irremediabilis undi, the bank of the waves or the flow, the water from which nobody ever comes back. And so this is like a dramatic moment. It's a funny moment. It's like it's got pathos. It's got a kind of very human detail to it. So we really see that Virgil is treating the underworld as a real place, as a place where you can go with a structure and an order. And the structure is a structure of judgment. It's about how you do in life. He reaches a place where those who have been unjustly murdered are found, where dead babies are. And again, King Minos is here to judge among them all. This is important again, because he'll show back up in Dante's Inferno, et cetera, et cetera. And one interesting thing here is that from the beginning, there are questions of whether the structure that Virgil is mapping is a just structure. And this will show up again in Dante. And Dante has to have a definite answer, which is, yes, this is ultimately just, perfectly just in every way. Everyone's in the place that they deserve to be. But one of the things that's great about the Divine Comedy is he asks, he feels a certain confusion or uncertainty. And I think he gets that from Virgil, where we look and we see, does everyone really deserve these punishments? Does everyone deserve to just become a shade? And the answer is essentially, I think, that what you're dealing with here is you're getting a lot of people who have carried their sorrows, nursed their sorrows unto death. And the key kind of ultimate version of this is Dido. And this is where we get our last sight of Dido in the fields of sorrow, the Lugentes Campi, the mourning fields. And this is where those who have died for love are found. And so Dido, of course, is there. And we have a fittingly heartbreaking end to the heartbreaking story of Dido. I told you that she was going to come back one more time. Dido has a lot of sad speeches, as we saw when we talked about Book 4. A lot of really incredible writing and speech and rhetoric given to Dido by Virgil. But I made the case then, and I will say it again now, that Aeneas' position is almost more heartbreaking, more painful, because he has to go on. And he makes some very powerful speeches too. And this is the one where he fully reckons with what's happened and grieves over it, but also confronts the fact that you have to move on. You have to keep going. And so I want to read this speech too, because this speech is the one that really gets me. He's looking at this silent shade. She's joined her husband Sichaeus, and they're in the mourning fields, the fields of sorrow. And he says, "Unhappy Dido," this is Aeneas again talking, "Unhappy Dido, was the news I heard the truth, that you had seen it through, this death by iron blade? And oh, was I the cause? I swear by all the stars and by the gods and by whatever honor there may be in these death-haunted regions underneath the earth, against my will, O Queen, I pulled back from your shore. In vitus regina tuo de litore cessi. I pulled back from your shore is a wonderful line. Cessi is like I drew away, not just physically, but also emotionally, right? Against my will, O Queen, I pulled back from your shore. The orders of the gods, which now compel me here through shadowlands and places thick with thorns and night, they forced me on with their imperial decrees. And I could never have believed that when I left you to this dark extreme of utmost grief. Hold back your steps and don't withdraw yourself from view. Who are you running from? Fate grants me one last chance, one final time to speak with you, and this is it. So that's the end of Dido. She never speaks again. She won't look at him. And there's a suggestion here, I think, that whatever wrongs may be done on earth, and there have been wrongs done in the love affair with Aeneas and Dido, including by Aeneas, really there's this inkling or suggestion that the people who are able to survive those wrongs are the people who are able to accept that there are bigger and greater things than our personal concerns. And you might even say this is the beginning of what Christian forgiveness might ultimately look like, that Dido can't let go of this wounded love. She's nursing, she's cherishing this wound, and she's back with her old ex-husband, her widow, and she won't forgive Aeneas. Aeneas is trying to get some kind of reconciliation. They have this opportunity, and he's saying, can't you see that now is the time to let this go? And he even says, because there's a bigger plan here, right? Because it was the orders of the gods that drove me unwilling, this cruel, hard reality. And Virgil acknowledges how hard it is at the same time as he says, there are concerns, designs grander than our own, than our human ones. And this is why I think Virgil really is, in his vision of the underworld, he's knocking up against the Christian vision, that it's not ultimately any one sin that condemns you to death. It's cherishing, grabbing onto your sin, and not letting go of other people's sins. And so the thing that would release this trap, that will set you free from hell, is forgiveness, for which the Greek word is aphesis, letting go, right, releasing. But we don't quite have that here. We have this terrible, awful, just refusal to let go. This imprisonment in the doomed love affair of Aeneas and Dido. Aeneas, his one salvation is that he's willing to heed the divine command to go on, and go on he will, because where we'll travel next is all the way up into Elysium, which is the field of the blessed, and ultimately the plane where we will see the full design of resurrection and of Rome, which is coming from the shade of Anchises. That'll be our last episode on this book 6, and we'll do it next time we talk. We will meet the ghost of Anchises. If this was a sad reunion with Dido, soon we will have a happy reunion with Dad, whom we've been missing very, very much. But before we go, let's do It Figures, which is the segment where I talk about figures of speech. These are names, words for official sort of trends or tools in the toolkit of poets and rhetoricians, which we can still use today. They're extraordinarily helpful. Knowing their names is really fun because it lets you point them out and observe them and see them when they show up, as they still do in movies and TV and all sorts of modern stuff. Today, the word I want to teach you is hyperbaton, which sounds like a transformer. It sounds like Optimus Prime and hyperbaton, but it is actually a word meaning stepping over, going over. And so this has a very specific usage, especially in the analysis of poetry. Sometimes, and this can get tricky because in rhetoric handbooks, you might see a slightly different definition than in English textbooks, than in poets textbooks, and so on and so forth. I always think it's best to start with the poetry definition. Sometimes you'll see the general definition that hyperbaton is just inverted word order, like resounded the hills with the song of whatever, Siegfried or what have you. That backwards word order is sometimes called hyperbaton. But the more specific and I think more useful definition of hyperbaton is this is a big separation between words that usually go together. And that's why it's called hyperbaton, because hyper in Greek means over and baton means going or stepping. So you have to step over a bunch of words that are in between two words that are supposed to go together. So now the easiest thing I think is to just show you an example of it, which we have in today's passage from Aeneas' speech. So I read that part where he says, it's the orders of the gods that compelled me, right? And this is a very, to me, heartbreaking line about how much Aeneas has had to suffer. He says, the orders of the gods, and he's saying, what he's ultimately going to say is, the orders of the gods compelled me, Dido, to leave your shores, right? That's the main clause of the sentence. Me iusa deum imperiis egeri suis. The orders of the gods commanded me or forced me with their imperial decrees. But though that whole sentence is broken up across 3 lines, and you get sed me iusa deum, the subject of the sentence, the orders of the gods, followed by this long, long clause, the orders of the gods, which now compel me here. It's a relative clause. Those orders now compel me here through shadowlands and places thick with thorns and night. They forced me on with their imperial decrees. So what's the effect of this? Why do hyperbaton here? Well, the whole point is, right, this is this long, winding journey. And Dido has decided that her whole life is going to be defined by her spurned love. But Aeneas is telling you it's just one episode in this big, twisting, cosmic plan, this winding journey that we're taking, and it's mirrored in the hyperbaton, in the structure of the sentence. Me iusa deum, the orders of the gods, quae nunc hasire per umbras, per loca senta situ cogun noctem quae profundam, which now compel me here through shadows and places thick with thorns and night. they forced me on, right? That's hyperbaton. It's to convey this sense of something being drawn out or long and difficult and painful. That's how Virgil uses it here, at least. And there are all sorts of other uses that you will now, I'm sure, perceive as you go forth and recognize hyperbaton, since you have learned it. That's it, figures. And the last thing that I always like to do is to answer a mailbag question. And today's mailbag question is one that I've been kind of touching on, but wanted an opportunity to deal with directly. And so I'm very grateful to Tiffany, who is a subscriber over on Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You have to be a subscriber on Substack to answer a mailbag question, or rather to ask a mailbag question and get it answered. Tiffany is one, and she asks, I love your show. Oh, thank you, Tiffany. I love your show. I've been listening for a couple of years. I have a couple of adult kids who absolutely love Homer. I have always agreed with them that Homer can't be beat and have never been a fan of the Aeneid until recently, as I have been reading along and listening while you go through it on your show. I have to admit, I'm finding myself loving it so much that I've begun to consider turning traitor to the Greeks and going over to the Roman side. Many such cases. I actually went the other way around. I discovered the Greeks second, so maybe it's the Greeks it's whoever you discover second, but you asked an important question. In your recent show, you talked about who was better, Homer or Virgil, and you addressed the idea that some people hold that Virgil is just a knockoff, but you said that traditionally Virgil has been considered to be the apex and the stream of Greek and Roman literature. So Tiffany's basically asking, what do you think? Put up or shut up, Clavin. What do you actually think about the relative merits of Virgil in the epic tradition? And here's what I would say, and I think this is what Virgil would answer himself, actually. If you read the Aeneid closely, you will see one of the things Virgil is saying is an artist can only produce the great art of his time. It's impossible, if you are Virgil, to write Homer, because Homer has already existed, and you, Virgil, live in a time where Homer has already existed, and Homer himself lived in a time where he wasn't trying to do some other thing. He was trying to produce and express his moment, his time. This is something that T.S. Eliot says, right? A great artist in writing himself writes his time. The thing that you can make only comes out of this moment, in just the same way that you can make an opera now, but you can't make an opera that is the great work of the 21st century. There's a wonderful story about this called Pierre Minard, author of Don Quixote, in the short stories of Borges, Jorge Luis Borges. And he writes these sort of surrealist or absurdist stories. And this one is, this guy Pierre Minard sets out to write Don Quixote, word for word, punctuation for punctuation. But because he's Pierre Minard, because it's happening in the 20th century, every word has a different meaning, right? And so he has to arrive organically through his life in the 20th century at the same words that Cervantes arrived at organically when he composed Don Quixote. But it's a completely different book because it's a completely different process that would produce it, and it would have a different valence and resonance. So if that's true, then that's especially true for Virgil. And Virgil is showing you the very distinctive position that Rome occupies in history, and it is the position of a kind of capstone or a way station on a transition from one world to the next. And that's where Virgil, I think, stands too. And part of the melancholy of the poem is Virgil accepting that he is living at the end of something and the beginning of something new, just as Aeneas himself lives at the end of Troy and the beginning of Rome, right? Virgil lives at the end of the tradition, the Greek tradition that begins with Homer and leads ultimately through the Roman Republic, but now is coming to a close. And what Virgil expressly shows us coming to a close is the lifespan of the Roman Republic and the history of the Mediterranean up to that point. Now a new epoch is coming. It's the epoch of the Roman Empire, right? Well, the big question that people have asked is, did Virgil somehow see that it wasn't just the Roman Empire that was coming into being? That wasn't the only new thing, but that Christendom itself was going to draw a full line down history, and that in fact we were ending not just the Roman Republic, not just the Greek tradition, but we were ending the pagan world. And now a whole new era, like the world itself, all of history was getting divided in two, and Virgil was standing there at the hinge. And so you can ask at a level of personal preference, do you like Homer or Virgil better? And I think personally, as a matter of personal preference, I still find Greek more beautiful. I still get I come back to the Iliad and the Odyssey maybe more. I'm rediscovering my love for Virgil now, but those are the sorts of things that you personally can answer at a level that doesn't have to be definitive or authoritative or absolute. Because at that level, at the objective critical level, it almost doesn't mean anything to ask whether Virgil is better than Homer. They are both pinnacles of their species. They are both the absolute summit of what can be done in that moment, in that medium. So for Homer, it's the song, the epic song of archaic Greece. For Virgil, it's the carefully crafted monument, the written monument to all that has gone before and all that may come next. And so I do think that for that reason, Virgil, like his hero, Aeneas, arrives at our doorstep carrying this giant bundle of everything that could be salvaged from the world gone by. That's what, remember, Aeneas does, right? When we first hear of him, he picks up his father and his gods and his son and he books it out of the burning city of Troy. And that's, of course, part of the story, but it's also an image of history. History ultimately brings all civilizations to a close. The pagan world is burning. The end of that universe is coming. And Virgil basically comes like Aeneas with carrying on his back everything he can, the fullness of, for instance, what we talked about on today's episode, of the pictures that have been painted of the afterlife, and puts it all into book 6, right? Everything that has been shaped and refined from the Egyptian Book of the Dead right on up to Plato's Myth of Error. It's all there. It's all refined. It's all given to you in this one picture. This is what this was. And now it's passing on. And Dante is, of course, the one who sees this about Virgil. And that's why Virgil is the one he chooses, not Homer, to take him through the fullness of pagan history and the fullness of life up until salvation, is because Homer couldn't do that because he lived earlier, right? He lived at a different stage in history. And so personally, my own experience is that I've spent more time loving Homer more passionately than I have spent loving Virgil. That's changing a little bit with this series, to be perfectly honest with you. So I'm with you there, Tiffany. But at a meta level, at a critical level, at an ultimate level, I don't even think we can or should ask the question, who is fully better? We can ask that about is Virgil better or is Ariana Grande better? There are qualities that are better and worse in art, right? And we can even say maybe that there's something more exciting or grandiose to us about being Homer than there is about being Virgil, or maybe the other way around. But Virgil is the best Virgil that we could possibly have asked for, and Homer is the best Homer, because they are themselves the peak examples of their craft. There were many others at the time, but these are the two that have survived. And Virgil, I think, has a special place because he is the guy that walks up in history to the very edge of the pagan world and hands off the torch, passes the baton to the Christian world. And for that, we will always be grateful to him. And whether or not he can pass into paradise, Dante makes a claim. We will only find out when we get there. All right. That's it for now. More on this incredibly rich text next time. Please, if you like this show, subscribe so you never miss an episode wherever you're listening, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, whatever. Share it around, let people know, rate it 5 stars. All of that really, really helps. Become a subscriber at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.